In the previous lesson, we very briefly introduced the nature of civil society and the ideas that civil society essentially relates to, and why civil society is such an interesting political question, not only from the perspective of politics and the idea of politics, but also from the perspective of political philosophy. This lesson is going to think about the idea of civil society throughout the history of political philosophy, thinking about how ancient philosophers examined the nature of civil society, and then thinking about how it was viewed within the medieval realm, and then finally focusing on the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, of course, being very important, thinking about the division between people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and thinking about how they understood civil society to be characterized from a philosophical importance perspective. So we're going to go and be looking at the historical development of this idea, the concept of civil society, the civil society as a philosophical concept and an approach. And really, this is going to take us all the way up to the Enlightenment period before we think about how modern philosophers and contemporary philosophers have been able to conceptualize the nature of civil society in the modern time, and how the ways in which contemporary politics has influenced this development of civil society as a philosophical concept. So as a just brief overview and a recap from the previous lesson, civil society, of course, refers to those institutions, the sort of aggregate of those institutions that aren't necessarily associated with the state, but nevertheless form part of the political community, the public sphere, if you will. And from an ancient society, from an ancient development, shall I say, the idea of civil society has its significant roots within classical antiquity. It was closely associated with the idea of the polis as it relates to ancient Greece. The ancient Greek philosophers, people like Aristotle, for example, very much spent a lot of time focusing on the nature of society and the nature of the state, what is a good state, what it means to be a good state, what it means to have good governance. Aristotle and Plato, in fact, have quite significant disagreements about that. Aristotle was a lot more empirical in the ways in which he understood the state to work. He went out and sought to understand how different states' constitutions operated, for example, whereas Plato was a lot more idealistic in the sense that what he believed was this idea that the best way in which the state can be ran is through a connection to the realm of the forms, the perfect ideas of justice, the ideals of justice, the ideals of good government. Philosophers like Aristotle believed that civil society was intertwined with the idea of the political community, or even the state itself. Citizens would therefore participate in public life and governance. So there wasn't this kind of disconnect that we can think of that we defined in the previous lesson between the idea of the state on the one hand and the idea of the civil society on the other. This all was wrapped into the basic idea of the polis, of the political community, of the society of the Greek city-state that Aristotle and Plato had spent so much time writing about. From the perspective of medieval philosophy, you can't really think about anything that talks about philosophy or talks about society or talks about the idea of civil society or the state without reference to religion. And so during the Middle Ages, therefore, the distinction between the state and the civil society became increasingly blurred because the church and the feudal institutions that existed as a result of and sort of as an arm and a wing of the church began to play an increasingly dominant role in the way in which society is organized. And so when we think about the role of civil society from the Middle Ages and from the medieval period, you have to examine that through the lens of religion. You have to examine that through the lens of Christianity. The role and the power of the Catholic Church had only increased over the time of the Middle Ages and over the time of the medieval period, up to the point of course, things like the Great Schism and the Reformation. But feudal institutions played very dominant roles in the ways in which society was organized. And the church would play a very dominant role in the way in which we perceive the ways in which society is organized. People would go to the church and go to religion for guidance on the nature of everything, essentially, from science to philosophy and theology, of course, and then all the way to politics and the idea of politics. Things like monarchy came out of and were derived from this idea that people have a divine right to rule, the divine right of kings, that they are anointed by God to rule over the kingdom of whatever part of Europe that we're thinking about. And that divine right to rule, that anointment by God, came and was part of a basic principle of hereditary succession, such that their children would also be able to inherit the throne and unquestionably be able to rule without any real restrictions on their power. Now, the idea of the civil society as a distinct sphere, as separate from the state, was not yet fully developed. But you do start to see the role that begins to be played when we think about the relationship between the monarchy and the people as we go into the Middle Ages and we start to think about medieval philosophy. At very few minor points do we see that there is a challenge from the people versus the sort of the anointed kings themselves. One example is, of course, the forcing of the agreement to Magna Carta in 1215 by the barons of King John. But ultimately, the monarchs of Europe during the medieval period went almost completely unchallenged and uncontested, especially by the sort of broader confines of the civil society, the broader confines of society. Maybe the nobility would challenge their reign or their succession or their legitimacy, but peasantry and the common class would not in any meaningful sense. When we get to the Enlightenment, then, we start to see things start to change quite significantly, and ideas about the nature of the political community would also change as well. So the modern understanding of civil society takes shape during the Enlightenment. The three main philosophers that we're going to explore here are Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all discussing civil society in the context of an idea that they describe as the social contract, as Locke and Thomas Hobbes describes as the state of nature, and just the emergence of a distinct idea of political authority. Hobbes himself, as pictured here, viewed civil society as something that emerged from the state of nature. The idea of the state of nature was this idea of a state or a society or a community before the basic infrastructure of the state existed, a state without a state, essentially, a community without a state. And Hobbes viewed the idea of the state of nature as being a state where individuals are driven by self-preservation, and so will have no choice but to enter into a social contract in order to form a commonwealth or a state. In fact, Thomas Hobbes was very critical of the idea of the state of nature, famously arguing that it would be nasty, brutish, and short. He understood that what was necessary was the complete and total subjection of yourself to political authority, to sovereign authority, as he described it in the form of monarchy. This was all elucidated in his book Leviathan, the idea that essentially a society without a sovereign is one that does not survive. He was very much influenced by his understanding of and his perceptions of the English Civil War, the overthrow of Charles I, the regicide of Charles I, the execution of the monarch, the establishment of the Cromwellian Protectorate, and then the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 by Charles II, the ways in which it was seen that monarchy was almost a requirement for good governance, despite the fact that there were still constitutional limitations placed on people like Charles II. James II was obviously then overthrown and replaced in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 by William of Orange. So therefore, for Hobbes, the concept of civil society is synonymous with the concept of the state. They do not exist independently of each other. Without the state, you could not have civil society. And by the state, we're talking in the Hobbesian language about the idea of complete and utter subjection to the sovereign. By contrast, then, John Locke saw things very differently. He saw civil society as existing prior to the existence of the state. Civil society developed and emerged, and the state emerged afterwards. For Locke, therefore, civil society was formed when individuals left the idea of the state of nature and instead decided to create a political society that was based on the protection of natural rights. John Locke believed that natural rights included things like the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to own property. That was a very important and key tenet of classical liberalism. And so from that view, because civil society existed after the individuals left the state of nature to create a political society, and then the idea of the state began to develop and emerge after that, it therefore meant for Locke that civil society and the state were distinct concepts, the former being a source of legitimacy for the latter, such that whereas Thomas Hobbes believed that the legitimacy of the state came from the legitimacy of the sovereign, John Locke believed that the legitimacy of the state came from the legitimacy of the civil society, the nature of the political community which developed prior to that of the state. Finally, then, what did Jean-Jacques Rousseau believe about the idea of the social contract and the idea of the civil society? Well, in his work, aptly titled The Social Contract, Rousseau argued that civil society would arise out of the transition away from the state of nature, but to a state society, shall I say, a society, a political group, where individuals would form a collective body. Rousseau described this collective body as the general will, and this was the general will to govern themselves. Now, he was critical of the idea that the civil society existed in his time, believing that it was to be corrupted by inequality and the interests of private individuals. And so Rousseau takes something of a middle ground approach to that, between that of Hobbes and Locke to a lesser extent. Locke believing, of course, that the civil society arises out of the transition away from the state of nature. So too did Rousseau. They both believed that civil society arose out of a transition away from the state of nature. But for Rousseau, the civil society was something akin to a situation where individuals would form a collective body, would form the general will to govern themselves. But also, unlike Locke, Rousseau was critical of civil society as it existed in his time, like I say here, believing that it to be a relatively corrupt and prone to the increase in inequalities and prone to the sort of the wills of private interests. And that sort of summarizes the sort of historical development of just the idea itself, the idea of the community, the idea of the political, the civil society, from the ancient times all the way up to the times of Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau. Now, we'll talk about some modern conceptualizations in the next video, but what I want to just really get across to people is this idea of the civil society being something that isn't a unified or all-encompassing or even necessarily homogeneous concept that has existed throughout millennia. In fact, the idea of civil society has been subject to not only criticism but also to major reforms since the works and the writings of people like Plato and Aristotle, with major conceptualizations being developed by people like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And as we will see in the next lesson, further developments and further conceptualizations being done by modern philosophers as well.